Anyway, so when most people think of drones, something that frequently comes to mind are these helicopter-like aircraft, and I've got one back here that I kind of use. It's kind of a really kind of a toy, but as a lot of people do, they can be modified for news gathering, for blogging, video journalism, anything like that. This device is called a Parrot quadrotor, quad for four blades. Um, it is it's got a 1080p camera, but the quality is not great. You'll tend to get that with lower cost systems. This one has been modified with a battery to extend flight time. This can be purchased from Brookstone or Amazon or directly from the company Parrot for about $300, and it's pretty interesting because it gives you the opportunity of basically having a flying camera. But most of these devices, especially the higher end devices, you'll find that they have a configuration with more blades. Maybe 6, 8, maybe even 10 blades, depending on the weight of the camera that's attached. And sometimes the camera is actually the most expensive portion of the whole system, basically, that and the camera gimbal, because electronics have just gotten so inexpensive nowadays that it's easy to just go up and pick this stuff off a store shelf and put it together to make it. But I also work with systems that are essentially smaller airplanes that are unmanned. The industry, such as Lockheed Martin, General Atomics, the companies that make kind of this equipment for the military, refers to them as unmanned aircraft systems, which is different than a drone because if you look at the kind of historical context, a drone is simply a remote-controlled aircraft, or in some cases, a boat, and that definition goes back to the interwar period between World War I and World War II, when the RAF was converting manned aircraft into unmanned aerial targets so that their airmen would have some way to gain experience shooting moving targets in the sky. And the British, known for their excellent wordplay, were converting aircraft known as the Queen Bee, and in changing it to an unmanned aircraft, a remote control, basically a large RC airplane, they changed it to drone, which is also a kind of bee. And so that's where the word drone comes from. But as you go with the definition, drone is not a terribly complex machine. If it's remote controlled from the ground, that means that it may not be operated from robotic means, so no onboard computers. Basically just kind of an aircraft that's controlled from the ground. That use has ballooned, of course, in popular media, but as I said before, the industry doesn't use that term drone. They'll frequently refer to it as an unmanned aircraft system, primarily because it is viewed as, instead of just the aircraft, which might be smarter than a drone, a whole system on the ground that you might interact with to control the aircraft. So the system comes from realizing it's not just the aircraft. There's a person on the ground, potentially with a ground control station that can be used to manipulate the aircraft. So when dealing... Oh, yes, go ahead.
I had a question, and we didn't get to this at the RX event, but as far as sizing of drones, how much do you have to think about that when it comes to the weather? So, wind and things like that. Do you have sort of a whole arsenal of them, and you kind of choose which one you want to use for particular weather? How does that work?
Yeah, so the choice of the aircraft sometimes is just decided by your budget. But generally speaking, the larger the aircraft, the more tolerant it is to kind of changing weather conditions and high winds. So the Parrot drone is pretty susceptible to the wind. You wouldn't really want to take it out in anything above maybe 7-mile-an-hour winds.
Okay.
On the smaller side, I've also been working with tiny stuff like this, which is kind of in the nano range. At this point, probably not very useful for for journalism per se, I do a lot of work in STEM education, but someday you might get smaller aircraft like this that are more capable in weather and in outdoors. You can't really fly this outdoors. So I mean, generally speaking, the larger the aircraft, the more expensive it is, but the more power it has, and the more ability it has to kind of tolerate winds and adverse conditions.
Okay.
But I mean, the cost is coming down considerably, and which means that a lot of people have been developing this on the grassroots level. So you might be familiar with kind of the maker movement, which is basically just kind of hackerism 2.0, and working with anything from art projects all the way up to these kind of unmanned aircraft systems. A lot of the maker movement is related to hacking open source microcontrollers, electronics, that sort of thing. This, for instance, is a small board known as the Arduino. Sold the world over, very successful in kind of the hacker and the maker community. You can do anything from light up Christmas trees to automate your entire house with something like this. But building on that, because it's open source, you get systems that integrate more sensors. So essentially the computer becomes smarter and smaller and can be integrated on RC airplanes or those small helicopters, the multi-rotors that I just showed. So this is actually kind of a, let's see, it's not going to focus very well on that, but it's about a credit card sized computer. This is called the APM, or ArduPilot Mega, and it also features a GPS that integrates with this whole system here, so that you can learn, so that the aircraft knows where it is on planet Earth when you're operating it. If the aircraft knows where it is, you can give it commands to, go to XYZ coordinates and hover. Eventually, we want to get around to the... Yes?
Hey, how hard is it to do that programming? For, I think when you look at journalists, some are very techy, some have spent a lot of time in front of the camera, some, just write. How hard is it to sort of pick up that programming?
The difficulty level has dropped a whole lot. Part of that is because there's already so many people hacking on this stuff in basements, garages, and kind of community groups, and releasing that information. I mean, sometimes that information is only can only be interpreted by experts who also know the hacker area. But a lot of these companies, such as 3D Robotics, which does make the autopilot here, has gone a long way in making it much easier to just plug everything in, download the software, and with a few clicks, get it to run. We're not there yet, but eventually what we would like to have, and what would really kind of make this space take off, is having it to a difficulty level where you just basically have your iPad, you put a marker down on a digital map, you turn on the drone, and it flies to that location.
Right.
We're not totally there yet. We're probably 2 to 5 years away from having truly user-friendly drones. I mean, some of that is just the technical ability level that you need to understand what's going on and to assemble this stuff. Some of it is also an issue with the aircraft's intelligence. This stuff is in continual development, and the drones are kind of dumb right now. So if you were to tell it to go to a coordinate off in the distance, it would go there, and maybe it would smack into a tree or a building because it doesn't know the building's there. Eventually, we want to get to a point where it can sense and avoid those buildings, trees, obstacles in the environment that you'd have when you're going out there to shoot video,
Sure.
and be able to avoid them. So the way we get around that for the time being is basically a person on the ground with a controller guiding it the whole way.
And what's the range generally?
The range can vary. I mean, you're very much limited to kind of the regulations regarding radio transmissions in the country in which you're operating. So you'd have to, in the United States, for instance, you might have to, if you want to operate in kind of the ham frequency to transmit video, you'd have to get a ham license to do that. You're also limited in terms of power that you can output from your system. And sometimes when you're hacking this stuff together, you're hacking stuff together that has the potential to violate those FCC requirements. But for those in the field who are kind of operating in in the black or gray area, trying to make this stuff work, have been able to get ranges beyond 1 kilometer, beyond 2 kilometers, sometimes even up to 20 kilometers, which beyond being potentially illegal in terms of your communications regulations, are also potentially illegal in terms of the air regulations for aircraft. So in the United States right now, if you're a hobbyist, can fly this stuff all day long, as long as you're away from a hospital or a built-up area or an airport. You can basically fly it all day long, as long as you're in visual line of sight. So you have to see the aircraft operating at all times.
Yeah.
A lot of the times when you look at the drone videos online, and the Telegraph came out with a really neat one recently. Apparently, southern Britain, southwestern Britain, is having a lot of flooding, and so they've a photojournalist from the Telegraph who has experience building this stuff on his own. Flew his aircraft and got some really amazing shots. We have it on dronejournalism.org if you want to take a look at that, and I can give you just a really short link to the story. But essentially, it shows kind of the versatility that you have, even within those kind of requirements regarding your, your radio strength and kind of the distance that you can operate. So I just have the I just put the link in the group chat if anyone wants to check up on that. But it kind of shows the versatility there. You've got aircraft that a lot of times I say they're a replacement for news helicopters, and that is true in some cases. But in other ways, you can't really describe the utility in just locking it down in terms of a news helicopter, because you're essentially creating these really complex camera shots. You're following vehicles as they wade through the water. You turn quickly to look at a stranded vehicle or a flooded house, and these are kind of maneuvers that you could only really do in a controlled environment, maybe even a movie studio, with a big budget and with things like dollies and cranes and tracks. And so instead of doing this in kind of a controlled environment, you're creating this really vivid moment with these complex camera movements out in the natural environment as the news is happening. I think that's something that you're going to see progressing as the skill level increases with these systems and as the difficulty level drops. So it does take a lot of time to be experienced with this stuff. I mean, that's why I say a lot of hobbyists are involved in this space, because they've invested a lot of time to figure out how to do this recreationally, and then realize that they can do this for profit or for their work.
Right.
Eventually, we want to have that so where any journalist can take it in their backpack, go out to the field with a few clicks on a tablet or their smartphone, launch the drone, and it just sits up there taking video.
Matthew, you mentioned the Telegraph. What other news organizations do you think are doing a good job using the technology?
CNN was probably a pretty good example of how to use this technology as well. For Typhoon. Sorry, what was the latest Typhoon? Cyclone? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. But anyway, I'm sorry. Yes, the Philippines Typhoon. So there's. I'm going to put up another link from CNN here that we put on dronejournalism.org because we thought it was a really great example of also what's possible here. Let me try to find it real quick. I don't know if I'll be able to find it in time. So, and it basically was this low-flying camera just flying over all the devastation in the Philippines, and which you couldn't do with a news helicopter because you can't get that low. And it kind of highlighted their disaster coverage. And it was really effective, but CNN didn't actually have anyone on staff in the Philippines to create that video.
Right.
What they did instead was contact a not-for-profit in the area that was using it for their own purposes, saw what they were doing with it, and basically asked, hey, can we also use this for this newscast we're looking to put together?
Sure.
So what you have frequently is not in-house production so much as a news organization contracting someone locally to basically do this work. But you're seeing this trend going towards in-house talent and in-house production of drones. So the Telegraph is one of the newer examples of an organization doing this. The BBC has their global video unit, innovations unit, has also been experimenting with this stuff. Right now they're not using it in any kind of live newscasts, but they're doing this for their kind of documentaries and their longer feature segments. And they do have to operate with with the right permits. They have to know at least a couple days ahead of time where they're filming and file the proper paperwork to go there and do that.
Matthew, can you go through some of the permit requirements and some of the legal concerns? Because again, I think we're pretty new at all this, or even thinking about this. So it'd be good to know what hoops we have to jump through.
Yeah, it will vary by country. So every country has their own authority for aviation. In America, of course, it's the FAA. In Canada, it's CASA. Australia has their own. The UK has their own. And so it will vary by country. And really, the best approach to understanding the regulations is to find out who the authority is and give them a call and ask them what their regulations are on unmanned aircraft systems. Or another term they use is RPAS, which is remotely piloted aircraft system. Or some still use UAV, unmanned aircraft vehicle. In the United States right now, there's basically no legal way to go out doing any kind of filming with drones for profit. So essentially you're limited to hobbyist groups, kind of people operating in the makerspace, and people potentially operating in universities or government agencies that have the authority to fly through a certificate called a COA, a Certificate of Authorization. So that's a process they have to go through, file paperwork, tell the FAA what system they have, how they want to use it. In some cases, the people operating the aircraft even have to have medical certification. So I mean, but the United States is kind of on the default kind of level when it comes to operating these systems. Other countries are much more permissive. So I mentioned Canada. We have a board member, one of our board members for dronejournalism.org at the Professional Society for Drone Journalists, has authorization in Canada to basically fly within a couple hours' notice. He gives the authorities a call. He tells them where he's going, what he's flying, and the documentation is already handled on their end because they know who he is, they know his history, and he's applied for this permission basically to fly on a moment's notice. Australia has a very similar system where you can it's kind of a DMV really. So they take you out into a field, you bring your aircraft, and you bring it through a variety of tests, almost like motorist training here in the United States, and they basically judge from that experience whether you're qualified to fly this without much oversight or without having to file big flight plans. The UK is kind of is not as permissive as Canada. I'm not so sure about other countries. It can vary from country to country. Some countries may not care what you do. Others might leave you, might keep you at the border if they see the equipment in your car. which has become an issue for a lot of people trying to transport this equipment across borders.
So if I can get some clarification, so you mentioned that a for-profit org in the U.S. can't fly in the U.S. So New York Times, they want to do something, surveillance of a garbage dump or whatever. Would they then contract that work out and then get the footage that way, or would they just not be able to do it?
It really is a complex situation here in the United States. There was a newspaper, a small newspaper. I think it was up in Michigan. It's in a place where it's cold enough to have polar bear plunges, because there was a photographer who took out his drone supposedly off the clock. This was a salaried photojournalist who also has a pilot's license, and took out a kind of a mid-range multi-rotor with a high-def camera and flew it over this polar bear plunge, gave the footage to the newspaper, which he worked for, and the newspaper published this video online. As far as I know, the newspaper did not receive any kind of angry letter from the FAA saying you can't do this, cease and desist your drone operations. But when the Pointer Institute contacted the FAA and asked them what's the legality of this, is this something that newspapers can do, the FAA's reply was that journalism basically is considered a commercial enterprise, and therefore that would not be allowed. Okay. So, in short, the general answer is no, but it gets more complicated if you're talking about a news organization like the New York Times going out and republishing video posted from community groups that have already recorded the stuff. Right. And I think that until we get some clarity about what the regulations are, we won't really know. I mean, there's a court case right now that should clarify somewhat what the FAA's position is on commercial drone use. The FAA has only slapped a fine on one individual so far. His name was Raphael Perker. He's from, I think, from Switzerland. He's from Europe, and he's kind of a daredevil drone pilot. So if you search for this group called Team Black Sheep, you'll find a lot of kind of amazing videos, high-def videos of zooming over waterfalls and through trees, and sometimes even in urban environments between buildings and this kind of stuff. And Raphael Perker took his drone over to the United States, flew it around over a campus in Virginia, and received a fine for a $10,000 fine. Wow. For a number of things. So it's kind of a laundry list of complaints that the FAA had. And one was that he was doing it for profit, but another was that he was putting people in danger, which is been baited kind of in this community. But for whatever the case is, that's now the subject of a legal battle that's taking place in a special court called the NTSB court. So anything that happens in kind of the aviation industry, in which the FAA is the regulatory body, if someone has a complaint against the FAA, the court you go to is the NTSB court, and that's where it sits right now. Depending on how that case comes out, it might turn out that the NTSB says that the FAA doesn't have authority for anything flying under a certain altitude, because flying under a certain altitude is considered to be part of your use of your private land. So it's a complex legal issue. For the time being, we can say almost definitively that for-profit news organizations can't go out and record this stuff. So going on the group chat, Erica writes, "For disasters, I wonder how this could be combined with the mapping tool that the State Department recently developed called MapGive," which is really cool, because that brings up a whole other aspect that I haven't gotten into yet about drones. I mean, kind of the public image of drone, when you say drone and these kind of small drones, you think of those helicopters. But that's actually only half of kind of the drone equation. So you have those multi-rotors, those kind of helicopter type aircraft, and then you have small airplanes, which is also something that I work on. I work on one in particular that has about a 6-foot wingspan, but it's made of balsa wood, so it's pretty lightweight. It weighs under 7 pounds. And the primary use for this aircraft is mapping. So the idea is that you go out to the location with this aircraft. It flies kind of a lawnmower pattern in the sky. It lands. You take the data from the airplane, the images. You take that to your computer. You stitch together a map. And when you stitch together a map, you can share that with people in the community. If it's related to disaster relief, you can show people the part of town that's flooded, which roads and which access points may be cut off. But you can also measure changes in the ground from one day to the next, and you can therefore measure and quantify the impact of any kind of development project, any kind of natural disaster, any kind of man-made disaster over time. And this is actually done at a very high resolution. So when you look at a Google map, for instance, you're talking about images which have maybe 30 centimeters per pixel resolution. So the tiniest feature that you can pick out in a Google map is about 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters square. To put that into to compare that to what a drone can put out, a drone is flying at about, let's say, 400 feet with just a kind of consumer-grade, run-of-the-mill, off-the-shelf digital camera, maybe 14 megapixels, 16, or maybe up to 20. You can actually get resolution down to 1 centimeter per pixel. So that's a huge difference from 30 centimeters per pixel to 1 centimeter per pixel. So you can measure things in finite detail, and unlike Google Earth or Google Maps or any kind of commercial satellite option, this is stuff that you can have in in a day's time. So instead of waiting months between photos or years between photos, you can get them. You can go out the very next day and take images and measure distances and changes in the ground from one day to the next.
Matthew?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about? I think this is again going to sound like a beginner's question, but
No, it's all right.
So, are there drones that can capture live video that sort of transmit down to, a laptop or something like that on the ground, or do they just take still photos, or does it take video and store the video on the drone and then you retrieve it when it lands? What are the options around that?
There are a lot of options. So I mean, when you're starting out with in kind of the space and you're looking at what's the cheapest, lowest end possibility, I'm going to get the drone back out. The Parrot drone. So the Parrot drone is operated from an iPad and has this 1080p camera in the front. The drone is controlled from the iPad on the ground through a Wi-Fi connection. So the drone actually shows up as a hotspot. You use that connection in the app on the iPad to control the drone and tell it where to go. But I think probably one of the coolest features is that it streams the live video down to the iPad through that Wi-Fi connection. Okay. So a term for that a lot of people in the maker community use is called FPV, or first-person video. So I mean, the camera's on the front of the drone. You're looking at the iPad. You don't have to look up at the aircraft if you don't want to. You can sit there with the iPad and basically navigate it forward, backward, and what you see is what you get in the video. So You can record that on the iPad. There's also a USB dongle, which you can essentially just slot in a flash USB drive, and it records the video right on the aircraft. So you would have to retrieve the drone and pick off that SD drive and take the video off of that. But that actually works out a little bit better because you get a better frame rate and a little bit better quality video when you store it locally and take it off the drone.
Right. When it's streaming live, it doesn't save anywhere, right? It's gone after the drone lands, right?
Yeah, unless you have a device on the ground that's actually recording the video live. So okay. I mean, if you have, and I think a good way to demonstrate it is this tiny drone. So I mean, I have no way to save any video onto the tiny drone here, but it is a wireless camera, So it transmits to a ground station.
Right.
And if I have a device, even just a VCR, it can record on that. If I had a DV cam with an input as an option, I could put that receiver in there and record the live video. But generally speaking, I mean, a lot of the systems depend on retrieval of the drone to take the card out, because when you're dealing with high definition video, of course, your bandwidth is limited through the air. And an option that a lot of people run with it's a little bit more expensive than the Parrot drone option, but not quite up to kind of the Octocopter $10,000 carrying a Red Epic, for instance, camera. Are these little tiny classic cameras by a company called GoPro?
Sure.
So this company became pretty famous recently because Felix Baumgartner, the guy who jumped from the balloon in the stratosphere, had one strapped to his head, and it was filming, the whole way down, and you could go online and look at that, and it's really cool because, I mean, it's very high definition, it's a very visceral experience, but I mean, long before Felix strapped this stuff to his head, people are strapping it onto drones. So this is a Hero 2. It is 1080p. There's since been a GoPro Hero 3, which is even smaller. And they all store the videos on SD cards, and so you do have to retrieve the drone. But when you get into this kind of stuff, you can get slightly better drones. There's a model by a company called DJI, which is a Chinese company, but they do have an office in Austin, Texas, that called the Phantom, and it's pretty handy. I mean, it has a GPS integrated, and it uses this GPS to kind of help stabilize the camera in certain cases, so you don't need to be constantly adjusting your controls. So that intelligence makes it a little bit easier for a person on the ground who's never flown this stuff before to turn it on and fly it, and come back with some pretty good video. That's a really good entry point for a lot of people, is kind of the Phantom system. There are other systems from DJI that work on the same principle, but it works out for a lot of people, and sometimes that's all you need. I mean, if you're the only game in town and you're getting 1080p video from maybe 20 feet in the sky, or even inches above the ground, skimming a disaster, then sometimes that's good enough for some people.
Sure. Okay. So, I think Catherine had a question.
Yeah.
And Carolyn. Sorry.
Yay. So Carolyn writes, what unusual ideas have you seen journalists using drones other than flood and typhoon, like you mentioned already? Also, if used for investigative journalism, do the same privacy rules apply? As long as someone is in a public space, can you take video of them? Those are fantastic questions. So the other ideas that I've seen using drones, besides kind of like natural disasters, floods and typhoons, is actually protests. So some may have seen the videos coming out of Bangkok that were taken from drones recently. Some of those are professional journalists, and some of them are just kind of amateurs. It's not always easy to tell because these two different groups sometimes use equipment that overlaps, so you can't really tell from the video who actually took it. But that opens up opportunities to look at police tactics and just generally covering a riot, happening, below as it happens. So in Thailand, you had, I think, both professional and amateurs taking video with drones. But I think one of the best examples of this being used over a protest is actually in the Gezi Park protests. You had and I spoke to this person over email, and he turned out to be a person who had gotten a hold of a system called the DJI Phantom, again meant to carry a little camera like this, and who lived in Istanbul and wanted to record this Gezi Park before it was going to be leveled. So he got this Phantom, DJI Phantom, and wanted to document and make kind of a personal documentary or put it online of the park before it was destroyed and turned into, I guess it was a commercial center and a military barracks. But when he went out there, all the protests happened, and he ended up recording some kind of historical a historical political movement as it was happening. He's also pretty famous not just for recording that, but also I think having the honor of being kind of one of the first people to have their drone shot down over a protest by police. The police picked it out of the sky because it's low flying and generally just hovering in one location, so it's fairly easy for them to pick it off. He was flying just basically a couple days later with a new system. So I mean, it was expensive for him, but not prohibitively expensive that he couldn't just go out there with one and do it again. And apparently he thought the risk was worth it. So I mean, that's kind of one of the more impressive things that have come along with using drones to cover these kinds of things. So, and another thing that getting in the data side again, something that I like to bring up is the Fukushima disaster, which America actually deployed Global Hawk drones for that disaster to kind of help give intelligence to the Japanese government about what was happening to their own nuclear power plants. So you had these huge Global Hawk drones, basically the size of a commercial jetliner, flying above the nuclear power plant, taking infrared and hyperspectral imagery of the plant, telling the Japanese government about how bad the situation was with the reactors, because of course you can't get near that on the ground. The Japanese government didn't actually give any of that information to the public. Instead, the kind of their line was that this wasn't that severe of a disaster, even though they had the intelligence that said that it was the situation was pretty dire regarding their nuclear reactors. But of course, that information never made it to the public. You could potentially imagine a scenario in the future, in a similar scenario, that you have a situation that relies on this kind of data to making an assessment of how bad the situation is. A journalist, or maybe a journalist affiliated with a not-for-profit, decides to deploy a system near a disaster, get that information, and interpret it internally, find experts to weigh in on the data, and then present that to the public, so that you don't have this sort of absence of credible intel, and you don't have to depend on governments for their data. So that's kind of getting in on the data side of things. That's where I'd like to see things end up, because you end up getting some really high quality, high resolution data that previously only really governments were had the privilege of obtaining. And on the issue of privacy, a lot of times, I mean, we already have things like peeping Tom laws that cover a lot of the privacy issues, but understandably there is a concern among the public that journalists would use this might potentially invade on privacy. And that's an important consideration, because, I mean, drones can go over fences. I mean, they can go up to very high altitudes, but they can also go very low. But I think a lot of the times the public doesn't really have an accurate feeling for kind of the capability of what a drone can do. So they may only be able to stay in the air for maybe 15, 20 minutes at a time. So they're not going to be hovering above someone's backyard indefinitely. And it's also an issue of kind of news value. I mean, is there really a news value in kind of going over people's I mean, even we have cases with celebrities. The old-fashioned paparazzi tactics still are what's popular. So I mean, even though drones have been around for a while, we still don't have kind of an outbreak of paparazzi taking these things and doing bad things with them. It's still more efficient for them to sit out with a car or to track someone in a car with a telephoto lens or things like that, as opposed to being trained with a drone and then finding the right opportunity to use it, the right weather conditions. So it hasn't become that big an issue yet, but we do have a code of ethics on dronejournalism.org, and one of those components of the code of ethics is that you respect people's privacy,
Sure.
that you only focus on things happening in a public space, and sometimes preferably with people understanding that there's a news drone in the area. So, I mean, at some conferences I've been at, there's been talks of making sure that it's visible, bright colors, maybe even identification markers, so that it's clear what the purpose is. And another component of that is kind of outreach too. I mean, if journalists really want to use this technology, and there's such a backlash against it right now, I think one of the best things to do is actually go to the public with the equipment, let them touch it, let them see it, so that they understand what it is, and that we as journalists are trying to help them with this, as opposed to trying to impinge on, trying to violate their privacy. So I think we have another question. This is from Catherine. I see applications for this in countries such as Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, where illegal logging occurs away from roads, or in situations where you need to assess water supplies, and that's an excellent case too. So the drones can be thought of kind of a mule for sensors. They can be taken in places where you can't maybe go on foot, but if you had this eye in the sky, that would really help. I think that the biggest hurdle for that is getting the drones into the country. Again, you might be stopped at customs, and it's also very internationally very difficult time to travel with this equipment. I mean, if there ever was a good time, but I mean, it's gotten worse recently. I mean, there's been activists in Egypt who've been caught with very basic drone equipment, and kind of questioned over this stuff. So I think the technology is to the point where it's not really the barrier anymore. It's more the regulations and still trying to get to the scene with it. Follow up from Carolyn. Can drones be voice activated, or maybe the better question is, can a GoPro camera do that? There's hackers developing voice-activated drones, and maybe that will be kind of the route that this all goes in the future, because then it's one step easier than taking out a piece of equipment and tapping on it. It's just tell you drone fly up, and that'd be really cool. I haven't seen anything commercially like that yet. And on the issue of the GoPro cameras, they are kind of limited because they are just stuck with the lens that you have, and you can't really focus anything with it. So it does have a fairly wide field of view, so you do get this kind of bubble fisheye effect. I mean, that might be good for some type of uses, but for other uses, you may not want that bubble effect. So I mean, the GoPro is kind of limited in that, but fortunately, you can look into. There are other options out there. Next step up, I would say, from the GoPro camera is actually attaching a DSLR camera to an unmanned aircraft system. And once you start doing that, you can really get into the high cost, though. I mean, you can get up into $10,000, $15,000 really quick when you start attaching DSLRs and kind of heavy lenses onto it.
So it sounds like the price ranges is like starting at $300 for the Phantom, and then there's some around like $500-$600. And it sounds like it jumps up pretty high after that.
Yeah, it's the more work someone is willing to put into the drone to assemble it and to make it work brings down the price a lot. I mean, the systems that I bring into classrooms are about $300 because we have to put it all together. The DJI Phantom is more around $600, but it does have it works right out of the box. You charge the batteries, you put it in, and it works pretty good. DJI is also working on a more advanced version of the Phantom, which actually has a built-in camera gimbal. So the camera quality is still around GoPro quality 1080p. But, you get into a lot more interesting camera shots when you have that gimbal. The Phantom doesn't have a gimbal, so you're basically stuck with a static view, and whatever view you get with the camera, you can only get through with the controls on the ground and actually manipulating the drone one way or another.
Sure.
Let's see.
Does anyone else have a question?
So we
I think
got yeah.
Carolyn had a question at 12:31 up there. What unusual ideas have you heard?
Yeah. I think well, the news media certainly are catching up. But as I said before, a lot of the kind of cutting edge stuff is being done in the grassroots. A really good resource to look at to see what people have been able to do with their systems that they've made in their own basements or garages or with community groups is DIYdrones.com. And a lot of the stuff that these people produce may not necessarily be high-end production value, but as far as going to a website and finding kind of proof of concepts or where this technology is going, I think it's an excellent resource because the stuff that people are making in this forum and talking about in this forum are going to be eventually commercially available to anyone, regardless of kind of technical background. And I think the mapping stuff is really kind of one of the best things to come out of that community.
I was just curious a little bit from an editor's point of view whether the video that you would get as an editor would be easily identifiable as coming from a drone.
In many cases, I think so. Drones can provide very unique effects, and it's almost like a fingerprint that you get with a drone, because they look like shots that you could create with a crane, tracks, all this kind of involved equipment in spaces where there could be no tracks. So in the recent Telegraph video, for example, it was well advertised that it was a drone that was taking the video in the text. But when you look at the actual video, you think there's no way that the crane could have gone out there and shot those images. The lines can be blurred when you're talking about more high-end productions, but in general, if you see a video and you think like, how did they make that? I'd bet 9 times out of 10 it's actually probably a drone. So a lot of sweeping shots where you cover a lot of ground in a short period of time, variations in altitude. Getting really close to objects. I mean, there's naturalists who've been able to kind of sneak up on wildlife, and there's a video that I could probably find of a naturalist getting really close to a moose with this quad rotor and not scaring off the wildlife. National Geographic has been kind of getting into this space as well, going into the African savanna and trying to get closer with this wildlife, get really amazing shots.
Okay.
So Carolyn had a... Apparently it's an issue in some countries that construction projects are paid for and not completed, or there's construction projects that happen and no one knows about them. So it is a good way to follow up and find out where exactly the money is going. Because if you can get this kind of intelligence about the construction projects and you can see stuff happening or you can see stuff not happening, it's visual evidence of where the money is going potentially. But also it is an issue of tracking changes to the environment as well. So big things such as mines, logging, as was said earlier, those things can not just be visualized, but they can be quantified. So you can determine what the environment will be like in the future, or if government data is being misleading about the impact to the environment, or maybe you're picking up something that you've never seen before out of a mine, out of a logging operation, out of a chemical plant. I think a really good example actually happened in the United States and in Dallas, Texas, in 2011, when a man was flying basically just an RC airplane with a DSLR camera attached and was testing his equipment around a meatpacking plant in Dallas, Texas. Was taking photos of a river in that area. Retrieved the drone, took the photos off the drone, was running through them and saw that the river looked very odd. It looked like it was painted red with paint. He gave those images to the Coast Guard and other authorities at the EPA that launched an investigation into the meatpacking plant in the area that he was flying, which then found out that the plant was actually dumping pig's blood into the river. This was something that locals in the area had complained about for some time. The stench in the area was very difficult for people living there, but no one had any idea that this was actually coming from the meatpacking plant until this guy showed up with his camera drone, took photos of it, and it launched this whole investigation. Last thing I heard about it, the meatpacking plant was fined, and the air in the area had cleaned up. So you had an obvious A to B correlation between the images and kind of an action or a response.
That's great. Okay, maybe Son, this will be the last question because we're running up on 1 o'clock here.
Sure. So no examples of law enforcement using drones, staking out stings and such. I don't, but I don't think that's far in the horizon. I think the hackers showed up to the scene first with the drones because they were technically able. But I think it's only a matter of time before you see police showing up with drones for their own purposes, and that brings up a lot of interesting questions. In the United States, it's probably farther distant in the future. There are a lot of states kind of taking a proactive approach to this, passing laws that say law enforcement cannot use a drone unless they have a warrant, a search warrant, and any data that you obtain from that can only be related to the investigation, and all the other data has to be thrown away. And the data can only be used in court with that. The issue after that, I think, becomes how do we as journalists get that data from the police? Because some of these laws say that the agency cannot give their data to to the public. So anything they do with their drone, essentially, the data they obtain from their drone is locked up or deleted. The public wouldn't have access to it like they would with FOIAs or open records laws, which just complicates the issue, because then how do we know what they're doing with their drones? I think other states, more authoritarian states, are going to be more aggressive in having deployed drones. I think the only thing that's stopping them at this point is potentially the capital investment to buy them and to train their officers. But as soon as that gets down to something that they can afford, I have no doubt that that's something that's going to be deployed in the future.
Okay. Well, Matthew, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I think Matthew's recording this, so we can get the video out to you guys and give it to some of the other people that couldn't make it. But this was fantastic. I think we learned a lot, and I'm sure we'll have follow-up questions.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. I always love an opportunity to talk about this stuff, and thank you for letting me record it. We'll have a link up for that later. But if anyone is interested in getting into the space even more, learning about how this progresses, we have open registration at the Professional Society of Drone Journalists at dronejournalism.org that anyone can sign up to, and we can connect you with more people, offer more information. We have a newsletter, and we're working on rolling out even more services for our community.